This is video 2 of 11 of the videos prepared for the P3 2017 Data Summit. I'm Matt Lavery, and I'm going to walk you through how we can find out the overall graduation rate of your students. This is in answer to question 1 from the questions guide. Now, our pivot table still looks like this, and in order to modify the pivot table, I need to make sure that one of the cells in the pivot table is my active cell so that the pivot table sidebar shows up. Now, I'm not interested in the cohort just yet, so I can drag that out. When it shows that X next to it, it's going to remove it from the table. It's still on my fields list, so I can still work with it if I want to. It's just not currently set up to be the columns. And what I'm really interested in here is the progress variable. So I'm going to drag the progress variable into the columns box, and it will show it to me this way. So apparently 826 of the students in this data set graduated in 4 years or less, and 77 of the students in this data set did not graduate. And so it's actually a little bit less than useful, because to really understand those values, I would have to divide by the grand total to figure out the proportion, and that's a lot of mathematics just to make sense of the table. Luckily, Excel can do all of that for us. So if we come down here to the pivot table sidebar and click on the downward arrow next to the P3 ID entry in the values box, that allows us to choose the value field settings. Now, this will pop up a dialog box in which we can do a lot of really nice customization to how our table looks. Now, the summarize values by field, this area lets us tell Excel what to do with the value in that field for each record. So keep in mind that we're working with the P3 ID variable, and that's just an ID number with the abbreviation for the university in front of it. So Excel treats it as a text value. It doesn't make sense to add it up or average it or multiply it or find any of these other things for that value. So we're not going to touch that. We'll leave that on count. What we would like to do, though, is for it to do some calculations after it loads the data. To do that, we click on Show Values As. And here, right here where it says No Calculation, that's what it's doing right now. So right now, it's just reporting the total. But if we click on this downward arrow, we can have it show that total as the percent of the grand total, the percent of the column total, the percent of the row total, etc. Now, what's interesting about this is that it can give us lots of different ways to sort of understand these values, but it really does depend on the questions we want to ask. So, for example, if I choose percent of grand total and hit OK, you'll notice that the grand total right here turns into 100%. And then everything else, every other cell in the table is calculated as a percent of that total. So the percent of the 5,042 students in the entire data set. Well, that does tell us that just under 60% of them went to UT, and just over 40% of them went to BGSU. But across the cohorts, these percent values don't make as much sense. So if 16% of the students in the data set graduated in 4 years or less, that doesn't really give me a sense of whether that's on time or early, and it doesn't really give us a sense of how to interpret that. So I'm going to go back to Value Field Settings, back to Show Values As, and now if I do it as percent of column total, now you'll notice that it's calculating the 100% across the entire bottom row. So all of the grad 4-year students are considered the whole, and then this tells us what percent of the students who graduated in 4 years or less went to BGSU, and what percent of the students who graduated in 4 years or less went to Toledo. So again, that might be helpful if I'm asking those kinds of questions, but I suspect that's not as useful to you as it should be. So let's go back to value field settings, click show values as, and it looks like percent of row total is what's going to help us. So we click percent of row total, and now across the entire row, it treats this grand total column as the spot where 100% is calculated. So of all the students who went to BGSU in this data set, what percent of them graduated in 4 years or less? What percent of them graduated in 5 years? And so on, all the way across. That's more helpful. Now, not all of those values apply the same way to students from every cohort, and so that's what we'll explore in the next video, how to analyze this by cohort.